They tell you the story begins with fire, with screaming longships cutting through gray seas, with horned helmets silhouetted against burning monasteries, with wild-eyed warriors roaring the names of forgotten gods as they butchered a civilized world. They tell you this story so often and so confidently that questioning it feels almost childish. Of course, Vikings existed. Everyone knows that. And yet, history has a quiet habit of collapsing when you lean too hard on what everyone knows. Because when you strip away the movies, the cartoons, the textbooks, the national myths, the museum gift shops, and the centuries of repetition, something unsettling begins to emerge. The Vikings, the way you imagine them, may never have existed at all. Not as a people, not as a culture, not as the unified civilization history claims terrorized Europe. What existed instead is far stranger, more fragmented, and far more inconvenient to the story we love. And the lie did not begin with Hollywood. It began with fear. The year is 793 CE. On the northeastern coast of England stands Lindisfarne, a small island monastery clinging to the edge of the known world. To modernize, it is quiet, almost fragile. To the medieval Christian mind, it is sacred, an outpost of God carved out of pagan darkness. Then the ships appear. At least, that is how the story is told. Dark shapes on the horizon, men spilling onto the shore, blood on holy ground, monks slaughtered, treasures ripped from altars. The sky itself, chroniclers would later claim, seemed to rage in horror. This event is traditionally described as the beginning of the Viking Age. But here is the first crack in the story. Everything we think we know about that raid comes from a handful of terrified monks writing years later, men who never understood who attacked them, never spoke their language, and never attempted to distinguish one northern group from another. They did not write, "Vikings attacked us." They wrote things like Pagani, heathens, Northmen, Danes, sea raiders, God's punishment. The word Viking does not appear, not once. In fact, for centuries after Lindisfarne, no one on earth referred to a people called the Vikings. That word would come much later, and when it did, it would mean something very different. Fear is a powerful storyteller. For the monks of early medieval Europe, the world was orderly, divinely arranged, and deeply symbolic. Disasters did not simply happen. They were messages, signs, warnings. When raiders came from the sea, fast, unfamiliar, and brutally effective, they were not analyzed like political actors or economic migrants. They were interpreted as demons in human form. This is crucial, because the Viking myth was not born from anthropology or archaeology. It was born from theology. The monks did not ask, "Who are these people?" They asked, "What sin have we committed to deserve this?" So the invaders became a single thing in the imagination, a unified wave of northern savagery sent by God himself. The chroniclers blurred distinctions effortlessly. Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Frisians, anyone arriving by ship from the cold north was folded into the same monstrous category. This was not laziness, it was necessity. The Christian worldview required a villain, and villains must be simple. As decades passed, the raids continued, not constantly, not everywhere, but often enough to reinforce the terror. Coastal settlements were hit. Rivers were used as highways into the heart of kingdoms. Fortifications were tested, sometimes failed. But something else was happening alongside the violence. Trade, negotiation, settlement, marriage, assimilation. The same Vikings who were remembered only as destroyers were also farmers in Ireland,
merchants in Francia, mercenaries in Byzantium, bodyguards to Christian kings, and founders of cities that still exist today. Dublin, York, Kiev, Normandy. These places were not built by a single Viking people. They were built by diverse Scandinavian-speaking groups with different laws, customs, gods, and goals. Groups that often fought each other as fiercely as they fought anyone else. Yet none of this complexity survived in the written record, because complexity does not travel well through fear. By the time the raids slowed, the legend had already hardened. Europe remembered the terror, but forgot the nuance. And then came silence. For centuries after the so-called Viking Age ended around 1166, the word Viking almost vanished. Medieval writers spoke of Danes, Norwegians, Goths, Normans, Rus, Swedes, but not Vikings. Why? Because Viking was never a people. In Old Norse, Vikinger referred to an activity, something you did, not something you were. To go a Viking meant to travel, raid, or seek fortune abroad. It was closer to pirate or raider than nation or ethnicity. No one was born a Viking. They became one temporarily, or were labeled as one by frightened outsiders. This distinction matters more than it seems, because once you remove the idea of a unified Viking identity, the entire narrative begins to wobble. So how did a vague activity become one of the most iconic civilizations in human memory? The answer lies not in the Middle Ages, but in the 19th century, a time of nationalism, romanticism, and desperate identity building. In the 1800s, Europe was reinventing itself. Nations needed ancient roots, glorious ancestors, heroic pasts that justified modern borders and political ambitions. For Scandinavia, particularly Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, this was a problem. They had no Roman Empire, no Greek philosophers, no grand medieval cathedrals. What they had were sagas, poems, fragments, and a memory, half real, half feared, of men who once terrorized Europe. The Viking was reborn. Scholars, poets, and politicians reached backward and pulled the Viking forward into the modern world. They polished him, romanticized him, gave him honor codes, national loyalty, and heroic purpose. The brutal raider became the noble warrior. The fragmented bands became a civilization, and the activity became an identity. And crucially, this new Viking was no longer Europe's enemy. He was Europe's ancestor. This reinvention spread quickly. Art depicted towering blonde giants with horned helmets, helmets that, as archaeology would later prove, never existed in battle. Operas dressed them in furs and iron. Paintings showed them standing against stormy seas, symbols of raw northern spirit. By the time Hollywood arrived, the Viking was ready. American culture embraced the Viking with particular enthusiasm. Here was a European ancestor untainted by Roman decadence, a warrior without empire, a pioneer before pioneers. In the United States, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Viking became something else entirely. Proof that white Europeans had reached America before Columbus, evidence of ancient destiny, a convenient myth in a nation obsessed with origins. Leif Erikson statues rose in American cities long before most Americans could point to Norway on a map. The Viking became freedom, strength, exploration. The fact that the historical evidence for Norse presence in North America amounted to a single small archaeological site was overlooked. Myths prefer simplicity. But archaeology has a way of speaking softly and ruining everything. As excavations increased across Scandinavia, Britain, and Eastern Europe, the physical evidence refused to cooperate with the legend. There was no uniform Viking material culture. Weapons varied wildly by region. Burial customs contradicted each other. Settlements showed more evidence of farming and trade than of constant warfare. Even the famous longships, icons of terror, were not exclusive to raiding. They were cargo vessels, fishing boats, diplomatic transports. And the people buried with them? They were not giants. They were not universally blonde. They were not all male. Women were buried with weapons, men with jewelry, children with trade goods. Graves showed genetic diversity that suggested intermarriage across Europe and beyond. This was not a single people. It was a web. As the deeper scholars dug, the uncomfortable question became more uncomfortable. If there